when everything began, before time existed as we know it, before the sky rose above the earth and the stars blinked in the firmament, before even the sea stretched to the horizon and light gave shape to things. Everything was an immense and absolute void, a boundless space without direction, without up or down, without future or past, a primordial and silent abyss where matter, energy, and life did not exist. The Greeks called that void chaos. But chaos was not simply the absence of everything. It was something more complex, more unsettling. It was a kind of disordered matrix, a state of infinite potential where all forms of existence were latent, waiting for a first spark to activate them. Chaos was the dark womb of the universe, a shapeless space yet charged with possibilities. It was, in a way, the first god. It had no face, no body, no will, but from it emerged the first great powers that would begin to shape the universe. The first to emerge was Gaia, the earth, solid, fertile, capable of hosting the life that did not yet exist, but was to come. Gaia was not only the ground we walk on, but a living force, conscious, capable of creating on her own. Her presence brought the concept of stability, of firm ground in the midst of nothingness. Alongside her appeared Tartarus, the deep abyss that stretched beneath the earth, a dark and feared place even by the gods who would come later. If Gaia represented surface and stability, Tartarus was depth and confinement, the bottomless pit into which those who dared to challenge cosmic balance would fall. Then Eros emerged, the primordial desire, but not a human desire, rather the cosmic impulse that pushes things to unite, to mix, to create. Eros was the energy of attraction, the principle that would allow life and movement to emerge from the union of disparate elements. Without Eros, everything would have remained static and barren. Nyx was also born, the night, an enigmatic and powerful figure who brought with her darkness, but also silence, rest, and mystery. From her, in a play of contrasts, emerged Erebus, the personification of the most absolute darkness, the one that dwells in the depths and in the hearts of men when all lights go out. With Gaia, Tartarus, Eros, Nyx, and Erebus, the universe began to gain structure. But something fundamental was missing: the separation between the sky and the earth. That was when Uranus appeared, the starry sky, sun, and lover of Gaia. Uranus stretched over her, covering her completely, embracing her in an eternal and oppressive bond that left no room for anything else. This union was not a romantic metaphor. It was the mythological description of a time when earth and sky were so close that there was no space for life, for light, or for air. From that suffocating union were born the first mythical beings, the Titans, enormous and powerful, destined to star in some of the greatest cosmic rebellions. The Cyclopes were also born, one-eyed giants capable of forging terrible weapons. And the Hecatoncheires, monsters with 100 arms and 50 heads, representations of the violent chaos still pulsing beneath the newly formed structure of the cosmos. But Uranus, fearful of his own children, kept them trapped in the depths of Gaia, hidden in darkness, not allowing them to see the light of the world. This imprisonment caused Gaia deep pain, an unbearable anguish that would eventually give rise to the first great rebellion in cosmic history. Each of these primordial beings had a symbolic function in the Greek conception of the universe. Gaia represented home, fertility, the possibility of hosting life. Uranus was the limit, the roof of the world, but also authority and absolute control. Tartarus was punishment and oblivion. Eros, the force that moves the universe toward creation and change. Nyx and Erebus were the constant reminder that everything born will, at some point, return to darkness. Thus, the Greek universe was born from a profound imbalance. a perpetual game between order and chaos, creation and destruction, life and death. The gods who would come later would be neither perfect nor just. They would be reflections of these first cosmic tensions, heirs to a tradition where every act has its price, and where destiny, a force older than the gods themselves, was already beginning to weave its invisible web. And while the cosmos took shape, the Titans remained imprisoned, growing in strength and resentment within the body of their mother. Gaia, desperate and in pain, began to plan her revenge against Uranus. The seed of rebellion was planted, and the universe had only just begun to breathe. Because in Greek mythology, every beginning contains its end, and every creation carries within it the seed of its destruction. Balance is never final. There is always a hidden force, waiting for its moment to alter the course of things. And so, in that still young world, where night and day did not yet exist, where time did not follow the rules we know, where the boundaries between matter and spirit were blurred, the conflict that would define the ages to come began to take shape. The Fall of Uranus. The newborn universe vibrated with a chaotic yet latent energy, as if every corner of the cosmos contained a secret on the verge of being revealed. Gaia, the earth, had begun to feel deep within herself the weight of an unbearable oppression. Uranus, the sky, covered her without rest, a constant and suffocating presence that kept her motionless, with no space to grow or to breathe. That union between sky and earth, which at first had seemed like a cosmic dance of creation, had turned into a prison with no escape. In the depths of Gaia, the children she had conceived with Uranus remained trapped. The Titans, giants of immeasurable strength, the Cyclopes, masters of the forge, and the Hecatoncheires, those monstrous beings with 100 arms and 50 heads, waited in the darkness, growing in size and in resentment. The confinement was not only physical, it was an emotional sentence. These first beings lived in shadow, deprived of light, of movement, of full existence. And Gaia's pain, the anguish of feeling so much life imprisoned within her, grew day by day. Gaia, who was capable of creating mountains, rivers, and seas, decided that she had endured enough. Her suffering could not go on forever. Fueled by a silent rage and a desire for liberation, she conceived a bold plan, an act of rebellion that would be forever engraved in the history of the universe. From deep within herself, she shaped a great sickle of steel, a tool destined not for creation, but for destruction. A blade that symbolized the final cut between oppression and freedom. But Gaia knew that she could not carry out that act on her own. She needed one of her children, one brave and ruthless enough to face his own father. She gathered the Titans, spoke to them of the pain she felt, described the suffering they themselves endured trapped beneath her flesh, and presented the sickle as the instrument of their liberation. One by one, the Titans listened, but the fear of Uranus, that god who ruled the sky and whose presence enveloped everything, paralyzed them. None dared to take the initiative. None, except one. Cronus, the youngest and most ambitious of the Titans, stepped forward. His character was cold, calculating, and his desire for power burned with an intensity that surpassed even his fear. He knew that this action had no turning back, that it would forever mark the destiny of his family and of the entire universe. But he also knew that it was his only chance to attain the dominion he so longed for. Without hesitation, he took the sickle and accepted his role in the most decisive blow of primordial times. The chosen night arrived, a night without stars, without moon, without wind. Uranus, unaware of the conspiracy forming beneath him, descended as usual to cover Gaia, to spread over her like a perpetual shadow. And it was then, at the most intimate and vulnerable moment, that Cronus emerged from the depths. Wielding the sickle, he launched himself against his father with a violence that shook the very foundations of the cosmos. The cut was brutal. The blade sliced through the celestial body of Uranus, tearing him apart in a way no god had suffered before. Divine blood gushed in all directions, falling upon the earth and giving rise to new creatures, as if the violence of that act had an inevitable creative echo. From the drops that touched the ground were born the Erinyes, the avenging furies, who would forever represent bloody retribution for any atrocious crime. The giants also arose, destined to challenge the gods in future wars. And from the contact with the sea, from the foam generated by the open wound of Uranus, was born Aphrodite, the goddess of love and beauty, a being who seemed to emerge as a direct contradiction to the horror of that mutilation. Uranus, defeated, wounded, and humiliated, withdrew to the farthest place in the cosmos. It is said that his voice, once omnipresent, echoed for the last time, casting a curse upon Cronus. A warning that, like in all the cycles of power that would follow, spoke of an inevitable fate. That just as he had betrayed his father, one of his own children would do the same to him. The prophecy was sown, like a poisonous seed that would one day bloom. With the fall of Uranus, the universe changed forever. For the first time, the sky and the earth were separated, creating the space needed for life to develop, for light to circulate freely, and for time, as mortals would later understand it, to begin to flow. The act of Cronus not only freed his brothers, it also inaugurated a new era, the Age of the Titans. But the price of spilled blood never completely disappears. Violence begets violence, and the cycle of betrayal was already in motion. Cronus, now the supreme god, had control of the cosmos, but he also had a shadow cast behind him, the silent threat of his own destiny. The earth, Gaia, had achieved her purpose. She had regained space, she had freed her children, but the universe that opened before her remained unpredictable, full of uncontrollable forces that sooner or later would clash again. The echo of Uranus's cry still floated at the edge of the sky, as a reminder that even the most powerful can fall. In the days that followed, Cronus consolidated his rule, establishing new laws and reorganizing the world in his own image. But as he governed, every time he looked at his own children, he could not help but remember his father's prophecy. A prophecy that would haunt him like an invisible shadow, a latent threat that would slowly consume him from within. And while Cronus enjoyed his newly conquered power, at the edge of history, in a hidden cave of Crete, something began to take shape. Something small, fragile, but with a destiny as inevitable as the dawn. The reign of Cronus and the fear of fate. After the fall of Uranus, the universe seemed at last to breathe in freedom. The separation between the sky and the earth brought balance, and the initial void was gradually filled with shapes, sounds, and life. From this new order emerged Cronus, the Titan who had dared to challenge his own father. Now, as the absolute ruler of the cosmos, Cronus rose as the new lord of all things, the god who governed the destiny of mortals and immortals alike. The Golden Age, as it would later be known, had begun. During this era, the earth flourished. The fields were fertile without the need for plowing, the rivers flowed in harmony, and the seasons had not yet been established as punishment or reward. Humans, who at the time lived without worries, enjoyed a peaceful existence, without disease, without aging, and without wars. The world knew no evil, no forced labor, and no suffering. Everything seemed to be in perfect balance, as if the universe itself wished to forget, for a moment, the pain of its earliest days. But beneath that facade of perfection, in the shadows where the light of creation barely reached, an invisible threat was taking root, a restlessness that Cronus could not banish from his mind. The curse of Uranus, spoken between screams and blood at the moment of his fall, still vibrated in the air as an unshakable warning. Cronus was condemned to repeat the same fate as his father. Inevitably, one of his own children would overthrow him. The story he had written with violence was destined to be repeated. That certainty haunted him like a shadow that never fades, like an echo that refused to be silenced. Cronus, despite his absolute power, was unable to fully enjoy his reign. Every time Rhea, his wife and sister, announced a new pregnancy, a chill ran through his body. The very idea of bringing more life into the world became a direct threat to his throne. Fear, corrosive and persistent, began to distort his character. What had once been ambition and bravery slowly transformed into paranoia and cruelty. Thus, when Rhea gave birth to her first child, Cronus did not wait a moment. With the same determination with which he had once cut down his father, he now approached the newborn, took it in his hands and, before it could let out its first cry, devoured it, without remorse, without mercy. With each child born, he repeated the same ritual. Hestia, the first, Demeter, Hera, Hades, Poseidon. One after another disappeared into his stomach, swallowed by the god who most feared being betrayed. Rhea, overwhelmed by grief, helplessly witnessed the destruction of her own children. Each birth became a ceremony of foretold death. Her suffering was indescribable, but she endured it in silence, afraid of provoking even greater fury in Cronus. However, when the time came to give birth to her sixth child, something inside her changed. Despair turned into determination, and hope, though fragile, began to emerge through the darkness. This time, Rhea devised a plan. When the moment of labor arrived, she secretly traveled to the island of Crete, far from Cronus's watchful eyes. There, in a cave hidden among the mountains, she gave birth to Zeus, alone, afraid, but determined to protect her son at all costs. To deceive Cronus, she took a stone, wrapped it in swaddling clothes, and presented it as if it were the newborn. Cronus, consumed by anxiety, did not question the deception. He took the stone and swallowed it, convinced he had eliminated yet another threat. Meanwhile, little Zeus grew in secret, fed by the goat Amalthea, and protected by a group of nymphs and the Curetes, warriors who danced and struck their shields to drown out the baby's cries and prevent them from reaching his father's ears. Zeus's childhood was surrounded by danger, but also by constant vigilance. From his earliest days, destiny seemed to accompany him like a silent ally, preparing the way for what was to come. Meanwhile, on Mount Olympus, Cronus continued his reign, unaware of the threat growing in the distance. Yet the fear continued to grow within him, a fear that not even absolute power could calm. Cronus had managed to keep his children under control, but he could not control the course of the prophecy, which loomed like an inevitable storm. During those years, the balance of the cosmos began to show cracks. Although the Golden Age remained a time of abundance, a latent tension seemed to seep into the air. The Titans, though loyal to their leader, began to sense the first signs of instability. The Earth, which had already witnessed one act of parricide, seemed to anticipate that another act of rebellion was being forged on the horizon. And while Cronus ruled with a firm hand, confident that his fate was under control, in a distant cave, Zeus grew in strength and character, watching, learning, and above all, preparing. The wheel of destiny kept turning, and the moment when father and son would face each other drew ever closer. The rebellion of Zeus and the Titanomachy. Zeus grew up far from the gaze of Cronus, nourished by the milk of the goat Amalthea, and protected by a group of nymphs who guarded his childhood as if it were a divine secret. As the years passed, the young Zeus became a strong and clever young man, fully aware of his destiny. From an early age, he knew that his existence had a purpose greater than himself, that his life was meant to break the cycle of fear and destruction that his father had established. The memory of his devoured siblings, the whispered stories told by Gaia and Rhea, and the certainty that the prophecy hung over them like a sword, all fueled in Zeus a sense of responsibility and defiance. He did not grow up with blind hatred, but with a conviction that matured over time. Cronus had to fall, and he would be the one to bring about his downfall. When Zeus reached adulthood, he sought counsel among the primordial deities. Gaia, his grandmother, told him of an ancient plan, a method to force Cronus to release the siblings who still remained imprisoned inside him. With the help of Métis, a goddess known for her intelligence and cunning, Zeus prepared a powerful potion. Wasting no time, disguised and concealing his true identity, he presented himself before Cronus. Pretending to be just another servant, Zeus offered the drink to his father. Cronus, trusting and unaware, drank without suspecting the deception. The effect was immediate and devastating. In the midst of violent convulsions, he began to vomit one by one the children he had devoured years before. First came Hestia, then Demeter, followed by Hera, Hades, and Poseidon. All of them emerged from the belly of Cronus alive, as if no time had passed, preserved by their divine nature that protected them even within their captor. The reunion between the siblings was brief, but enough to seal a pact of unity. They knew that simply being free was not enough. Cronus was still powerful, and his rule over the cosmos remained firm. If they wanted to change the fate of the world, they had to confront him directly, without hesitation, in an open conflict that would define the future of the universe. Thus began the Titanomachy, a war of cosmic proportions, a confrontation that would shake the celestial order and last for 10 years without truce or rest. On one side, Cronus and the Titans, from the heights of Mount Othrys, forming a solid, imposing, and experienced front. On the other side, Zeus and his siblings, still young but determined, entrenched on Mount Olympus, from where they would launch their struggle for ultimate control of the cosmos. The first battles were brutal. The sky and the earth trembled with every clash. Mountains were uprooted and thrown as colossal weapons. Rivers changed their course, and stars seemed to dim in the face of the destruction. The Titans, with their overwhelming strength and millennia of experience, appeared to have the upper hand. Cronus, commanding the front, led each attack with the fury of a god who refused to relinquish his power. Zeus, aware that brute force alone would not win the war, turned to strategy. Remembering the teachings of Gaia, he decided to seek allies in the depths of Tartarus. There, imprisoned since the days of Uranus, remained the Hecatoncheires and the Cyclopes, beings who knew better than anyone the bitterness of confinement and the desire for revenge. Defying the danger, Zeus descended into Tartarus and, breaking the chains that held them captive, offered them freedom in exchange for their help in battle. The Cyclopes, grateful, gave Zeus a weapon that would mark a turning point, the Thunderbolt. A burst of pure energy, capable of splitting the sky and destroying any form of life or matter. To Hades, they gave the Helmet of Invisibility, a tool that would allow him to move unseen amid the chaos. To Poseidon, they gave the Trident, a weapon with which he could provoke earthquakes and command the waters at will. With these new weapons and allies, the course of the war changed drastically. Zeus, armed with the Thunderbolt, became an unstoppable force. He hurled lightning bolts that ignited the air and split the earth. Poseidon unleashed storms and summoned tsunamis that devastated the enemy flanks. Hades, hidden by his helmet, sabotaged the Titans' defenses from the shadows. The final battle was the climax of that titanic conflict. In a confrontation that lasted for entire days, the sky darkened, the seas boiled, and the earth cracked open. Zeus, with a fury contained for years, launched a barrage of thunderbolts directly at Mount Othrys, reducing the stronghold of the Titans to rubble and ashes. Cronus, exhausted and defeated, finally fell before the unstoppable force of his son. After the victory, Zeus showed no mercy. Following the destiny of the great cosmic betrayals, he imprisoned Cronus and the Titans in Tartarus, reinforcing their prison with bronze walls and gates guarded by the Hecatoncheires. There they would remain, in the most absolute darkness, isolated from light and time, so they could never again threaten the balance of the world. With the Titanomachy ended, the universe was ready for a new era, the era of the Olympian gods. Zeus, along with his siblings, took control of the cosmos, dividing power among themselves to prevent the same cycle of oppression and fear from repeating. And as the dust of war settled, and the echoes of battle slowly faded, a new chapter opened on the horizon. One in which the gods, now established on Olympus, would begin to rule, to love, to fight, and at times, to destroy what they had sworn to protect. The birth of Olympus. After the devastation of the Titanomachy, the world found itself in a kind of tense calm, as if the entire universe were holding its breath, waiting to see what the next step of those new victors would be. The dust of battle still floated in the air. The scars of the war remained open upon the land, and the echo of Zeus's lightning still resounded in the farthest reaches of the sky. But despite the recent destruction, for the first time in countless ages, there was space for a new beginning. Zeus, together with his brothers and sisters, faced a responsibility that went far beyond military victory. The war had ended, but the true challenge was only just beginning: to establish a new order that would give meaning to the chaos, to divide power among the gods who had just been freed, and to rebuild the balance that had been destroyed after the overthrow of Cronus and the fall of the Titans. The first great decision was to choose a place that would become the sacred dwelling of these new gods, a site that would stand above the world of men, but not so far away as to lose all connection with the earth they now ruled. Mount Olympus, a majestic mountain that rose above the clouds, was chosen, not by chance, but because its height seemed to touch the sky, and its firm base connected to the earth. An intermediate point between the divine and the earthly, between the unreachable and the visible. There, at the very summit of Mount Olympus, the gods raised their palace, a structure made of materials no human could understand, forged with light, with mist, with an air so pure it could never be breathed at ground level. The columns of Olympus seemed to support the very firmament, and its halls shone with a brilliance that did not come from the sun, but from their own essence, as if the cosmos itself had decided to illuminate that dwelling. Each god received his or her place in this new home. Zeus, as the absolute sovereign, occupied the highest throne from where he could behold everything that happened in the world: the storms, the seas, the mountains, the fields, and even the smallest of humans. Poseidon took his residence in the depths of the sea, although his place on Olympus was always kept ready for whenever he chose to take part in divine affairs. Hades, for his part, preferred to withdraw to the underworld, creating his own kingdom, far from the light, where the souls of the dead would be received and judged. But Olympus would not be a place inhabited only by them. Soon, other deities joined them, each with their own character, their passions, and their specific powers. Hera, the proud and jealous wife of Zeus, became the goddess of marriage and family. Demeter, protector of agriculture and of the harvests, watched over the fertility of the land. Hestia, symbol of the home and of the sacred fire, kept alight the flame that represented the stability of the universe. And so, little by little, Olympus filled with life. It was not a place of constant peace nor of eternal harmony. The coexistence of the gods, each with their desires, their temperaments, and their vision of the world, gave rise to constant conflicts, fleeting alliances, carefully planned acts of revenge, and decisions that would affect both gods and mortals. Zeus, from his throne, established the new rules of the universe. He divided the control of the cosmos into 3 great domains. To him belonged the sky, the thunder, and the storm. To Poseidon, the sea, and all its creatures. To Hades, the underworld, and the realm of the dead. The earth and the rest of the world remained as neutral territory, influenced by all of them, but governed mainly by Zeus from the heights. But Zeus was not a solitary ruler. The rest of the gods also claimed their place in the administration of the cosmos. Aphrodite brought with her desire and passion. Apollo became the god of light, of music, and of prophecies. Artemis claimed the forests and the hunt. Ares, the god of war, ensured that violence would never disappear from the world. Athena, born from the head of Zeus, became the goddess of wisdom and military strategy. Hermes, the messenger, took on the role of intermediary between gods and men, defying physical and spiritual boundaries. Olympus began to vibrate with a rhythm of its own, with its celebrations, its conspiracies, and its secrets. The banquets were colossal, the arguments epic, and the intrigues constant. From there, the gods watched over humans, sometimes with curiosity, sometimes with contempt, but always intervening, directly or indirectly, in their destinies. The new era had begun, and although the reign of Zeus seemed firm, the very nature of the Olympian gods made it impossible to predict how long that balance would last. The victory over the Titans had not eliminated conflict. It had only transformed it. The tension between the authority of Zeus and the will of the other gods began to grow, fueled by passions, broken promises, and old wounds that had never fully healed. Because Olympus, no matter how magnificent and luminous it was, would never be a place of true calm. Each god, with his or her ego and ambition, would bring with them new stories, new loves, new betrayals. And soon, very soon, the apparent stability of the new order would be put to the test by conflicts that would affect not only the gods, but also the mortals who, without knowing it, lived under the shadow of these immortal deities. The loves and deceptions of the gods. Peace on Mount Olympus was an illusion that lasted only as long as it took for the next divine whim to arise. On the outside, the palace of the gods shone with an almost unbearable beauty, but within its walls, the lives of the immortals were a constant mixture of intrigue, deception, uncontrollable passions, and calculated revenge. Absolute power did not bring serenity. On the contrary, it seemed to ignite the most primal instincts and the most unrestrained emotions. Among all the gods, there was one whose reputation for inconstancy and seduction surpassed all others: Zeus. The king of the sky, lord of thunder and guardian of cosmic order, seemed incapable of resisting any mortal or immortal who stirred his desire. His conquests were numerous, his methods varied, and on many occasions, scandalously cruel. There was no form he would not adopt to approach his targets. He became a bull, a swan, a shower of gold, a swift eagle, or any creature capable of slipping past the defenses of his chosen one. Leda, for example, was seduced by Zeus in the form of a majestic swan that descended from the sky as if sent by the gods themselves. Europa was abducted when the god, disguised as a magnificent white bull, carried her across the sea to Crete. Danae, locked in a tower to prevent her from bearing children, received the visit of the king of the gods in the form of golden rain that slipped through every crack in her prison. And the list went on. Semele, Alcmene, Io, Callisto, all of them drawn in one way or another into the will of a god who seemed insatiable. But each of Zeus's affairs brought with it an echo of fury and pain. Hera, his wife and queen of Olympus, was not a passive observer. Her character, proud and strong, drove her to punish not only her husband's lovers, but also the children born from those forbidden unions. Hera channeled her rage in terrible and sophisticated ways, turning the lives of her victims into true torment. Io, for instance, was transformed into a cow and condemned to wander without rest, tormented by a gadfly sent by Hera herself. Semele, pregnant by Zeus, was manipulated into her own destruction when she asked to see the god in all his glory. an act that consumed her completely. Even Heracles, perhaps the most famous of Zeus's children, paid the price of Hera's wrath. From the moment of his birth, the goddess tried to destroy him, sending snakes to his cradle and later driving him into a temporary madness that would lead him to commit atrocious acts that marked the rest of his existence. But Hera was not the only one capable of jealousy and vengeance. Aphrodite, goddess of love and beauty, embodied seduction in divine form. Her power was such that she could unsettle the minds of gods and mortals alike, unleashing passions impossible to contain. Aphrodite possessed the gift of attraction, but also a capricious will that led her to toy with the emotions of those who fell under her influence. Even Ares, god of war and symbol of violence, fell victim to her charms. Their relationship was a scandal in Olympus, not only because Aphrodite was married to Hephaestus, the god of the forge, but because the passion between the two lovers was impossible to hide. Hephaestus, humiliated and wounded in his pride, crafted an almost perfect trap. He created an invisible net of golden threads, fine and unbreakable, and placed it on the bed where Aphrodite and Ares usually met. The trap snapped shut at the most intimate moment, leaving them immobilized. Hephaestus then called upon all the gods to witness the betrayal and his public revenge. The laughter, the mockery, and the shame marked that day as one of the most scandalous episodes in the history of the gods. But the betrayals did not end there. Artemis, the huntress goddess, protector of virginity and enemy of lust, also starred in stories tinged with cruelty. Her disdain for those who dared to look upon her nakedness or disturb her hunting led her to punish mercilessly men such as Actaeon, who, after glimpsing her by accident as she bathed in a stream, was transformed into a stag and torn apart by his own hounds. Apollo, Artemis's twin brother, was not free from emotional entanglements either. His pride and beauty made him desire women such as Daphne, who, terrified by the god's pursuit, begged her father, the river god, to save her. The transformation was immediate. Daphne became a laurel tree, condemned to remain still forever, but free from Apollo's advances. The god, filled with sorrow, declared the laurel his sacred tree from that day on. At the other end of the spectrum, Hermes, the messenger of the gods, known for his cleverness and speed, preferred games of wit over amorous conquests. His deceptions were not driven by passion but by strategy. From a very young age, he displayed his skill in theft and manipulation, starring in several pranks that provoked both laughter and irritation among his Olympian siblings. He stole Apollo's cattle when he was barely a newborn, and then, with masterful persuasion, convinced his brother to forgive him by gifting him the lyre as a symbol of reconciliation. Each story, each betrayal, each romance on Olympus served as a reflection of human passions taken to the extreme. The Greek gods were not distant, untouchable, or perfect figures. They were beings with virtues and flaws, with weaknesses remarkably similar to those of any mortal. Capricious, vengeful, tender, or ruthless. Each one represented a different facet of human nature projected on a cosmic scale. The loves and deceptions of the gods created a legacy of myths that explained natural phenomena, social behaviors, and even human emotions. Storms could be the result of an argument between Zeus and Hera, earthquakes the result of Poseidon's rage, and an uncontrollable passion could be seen as the direct influence of Aphrodite over the hearts of men. And while Olympus remained the stage for new intrigues, below, in the land of mortals, the echoes of those divine passions began to leave their mark. Soon, the relationship between gods and humans would become more dangerous, more complex, and in many cases, more tragic. The theft of fire and the vengeance of the gods. At the summit of Mount Olympus, while the gods celebrated endless banquets and wove new intrigues, down below, in the land of men, the newly created humanity suffered under the shadow of deprivation and ignorance. They did not know the warmth of fire, did not know how to cook their food, how to protect themselves from the darkness, or how to defend themselves from the cold. Their nights were long, their winters unbearable, and their existence was vulnerable to any threat that nature might present. Zeus, in his unpredictable character and his obsessive need to control the balance between gods and mortals, had decided to keep fire away from humanity. It was not a mere whim. Fire, for the Greeks, represented more than just a source of warmth or light. It was the symbol of knowledge, of progress, of independence. With fire, men could begin to be less dependent on the gods, and Zeus was not willing to allow that. But among the deities, there was one figure who saw in humanity something more than mere pawns in a divine game. Prometheus, whose name means the one who thinks ahead, belonged to the race of the Titans, but had remained on Zeus's side during the Titanomachy. His intelligence, his ability to foresee consequences, and his sympathy toward humans made him an atypical god. While others saw humans as insignificant creatures, Prometheus felt for them a mixture of affection and responsibility. As time passed and he observed human suffering, Prometheus decided that he could no longer remain a silent witness. Zeus's decision to deny them fire seemed to him unjust, cruel, and contrary to the natural progress of life. And so, moved by the impulse to protect mortals, he devised a bold and dangerous plan. One night, seizing a moment of distraction on Olympus, Prometheus secretly descended to the forge of Hephaestus, the blacksmith god, where the eternal flame burned without rest. He took a small ember, hid it inside the hollow stem of a fennel stalk to keep it from going out, and fled with it toward the land of men. That flame, insignificant in appearance, contained the power to transform civilization. When humanity received the fire, the reaction was immediate. For the first time, they could cook their food, illuminate their caves, forge tools and weapons, and begin to master their surroundings. The spark of civilization was lit that night, and with it, the promise was born that men could cease to be eternal victims of divine whim. But as expected, Zeus's reaction was swift. When he discovered the theft, his fury was monumental. The god of thunder, betrayed by a former ally, felt that his authority had been challenged in the most direct way possible. What Prometheus had done was not simply disobeying an order. It was a declaration of war against the balance that Zeus had fought so hard to maintain. The vengeance was as exemplary as it was relentless. Zeus ordered Prometheus to be captured and chained atop a desolate mountain where the winds were icy and the solitude infinite. There, high in the Caucasus Mountains, Prometheus was immobilized, his arms and legs bound by unbreakable chains forged by Hephaestus under the direct order of the king of the gods. But the physical punishment was not enough for Zeus. Each day, a massive eagle, sent by the god himself, descended upon Prometheus's body and devoured his liver. Because he was immortal, his body regenerated during the night, only to suffer again the next day. Day after day, century after century, the torment repeated with almost cruel precision, turning Prometheus's pain into a kind of eternal ritual. The legend of Prometheus's punishment was not only a warning to other gods, it was a message to all of humanity. Disobedience, defiance of the order imposed from Olympus, would always carry consequences, even for those who seemed untouchable. But Zeus's vengeance did not end there. The god decided that men too should pay a price for accepting the stolen fire. And thus, the second great punishment was born: Pandora. Zeus ordered Hephaestus to mold the first woman out of clay, a perfect creation in appearance, endowed with incomparable beauty, but also burdened with a fateful destiny. Each god granted her a gift. Aphrodite gave her grace and desire, Hermes cunning and deceit, Apollo the gift of music, Athena the skills for domestic tasks. But along with these visible gifts, Pandora was given an insatiable curiosity, a trait that would end up unleashing the greatest evil upon humanity. Zeus gave Pandora a mysterious jar, which centuries later would be mistakenly known as a box, and forbade her to open it under any circumstance. With a mix of fear and fascination, Pandora accepted the charge, but curiosity ultimately proved stronger. When she finally lifted the lid, from within emerged all the evils that the world had never known: pain, disease, war, envy, hunger, and death. One after another, those misfortunes spread across the earth, forever altering the existence of humankind. Only one last element remained at the bottom of the jar: hope. A small consolation amid the chaos, as if the universe, even at its worst, refused to completely abandon humanity. Thus, with the punishment of Prometheus and the sending of Pandora, Zeus re-established the control he believed he had lost. But Prometheus's heroic act had left an indelible mark. Humanity, now with fire and with the knowledge it brought, had begun to walk a path that not even the gods would be able to stop completely. From that moment on, the relationship between gods and men would change forever, opening the door to countless new conflicts, dangerous alliances, and tragedies that would mark the generations to come. The great eternal punishments. Olympus was, in appearance, a place of banquets, music, and cosmic decisions. But behind that facade of grandeur and power, there was another aspect, less glorious, but just as fundamental to the essence of Greek mythology: eternal punishment. Divine justice in the hands of the gods rarely offered redemption. The penalties imposed by the deities were not temporary or symbolic. They were final, physical, and above all, exemplary. Each punishment conveyed a clear and chilling message. Defying the order imposed by the gods came at a price that no being, mortal or immortal, could pay without suffering the consequences forever. One of the most well-known and terrifying cases was that of Sisyphus. King of Corinth and master of cunning, Sisyphus not only deceived mortals and gods alike, but even managed to outwit death itself. On one occasion, using his cleverness, he captured Thanatos, the personification of death, chaining him up and thus halting the natural cycle of life. No one died. Wars continued endlessly, and the balance of the universe began to falter. The gods, alarmed, intervened to free Thanatos and restore order, but the audacity of Sisyphus did not go unpunished. As retaliation, he was condemned to a task that defied all logic. Day after day, he had to push a huge rock up a steep hill, and just when it seemed he was about to reach the summit, the rock, as if it had a will of its own, would roll back down into the valley, forcing him to start again from the bottom. Eternity for Sisyphus did not mean physical pain, but a devastating psychological torture, endless effort, achievement forever out of reach, an endless repetition of hope and frustration. Another example of eternal punishment is that of Tantalus, a king who was invited to dine at the very table of Olympus, sharing a meal with the gods. But his insolence, his lack of respect, and above all, his unforgivable crime of offering his own son as a banquet to test the omniscience of the gods, earned him an even more macabre sentence. Tantalus was sent to Tartarus, the deepest prison of the underworld, where he was submerged up to his neck in crystal-clear waters, with branches laden with fruit hanging just above his head. The irony of his punishment was as sophisticated as it was cruel. Each time he lowered his head to drink, the water would withdraw, and each time he raised his hand to reach for a fruit, the branches would move beyond his grasp. Eternal hunger and thirst in the midst of abundance, a perpetual mockery of his desire to challenge the gods. Ixion, for his part, was another who paid an eternal price for his audacity. This king, whose lineage already carried a history of betrayals, committed one of the most unforgivable acts, he attempted to seduce Hera, the queen of Olympus. Zeus, ever watchful and jealous of his position, decided to give him a lesson no one would forget. Ixion was bound to a fiery wheel that spun without stopping through the heavens and the underworld, a constant rotation that symbolized his insatiable desire and his irreversible betrayal. The Erinyes, also known as the Furies, played a fundamental role in carrying out these punishments. These female deities, born from the blood spilled by Uranus, represented relentless vengeance, moral and emotional punishment. They pursued those guilty of family crimes, such as the murder of a relative or the betrayal of a sacred oath. They did not rest, they did not stop, they offered no mercy. Their mission was to hound the guilty day and night, driving them to madness or suicide, as happened with Orestes, who, after killing his mother, was tormented by them until he lost his sanity. Tartarus, the deep abyss where these condemned souls served their sentences, was not a simple physical space. It was a concept of absolute despair, a kind of non-place where time and space lost all meaning. There were no sunrises, no comfort of sleep, no hope for a better future. Every corner of Tartarus was a perpetual reminder of the consequences of defying the gods. But eternal punishments did not fall only upon great kings or lesser gods. Even titans such as Atlas suffered perpetual penalties. After the defeat in the Titanomachy, Zeus imposed upon Atlas a fate without end, to hold upon his shoulders the vault of the sky. Day after day he had to bear the weight of the heavens, with no possibility of rest or relief. A sentence that symbolized the definitive separation between sky and earth, a cosmic fracture that the Titan had to support with his body forever. Each of these punishments served a pedagogical function in Greek mythology. They were living lessons, warnings for mortals and gods alike. Disobedience, excessive pride, betrayal, and lack of respect for cosmic laws were paths that led inevitably to eternal suffering. Meanwhile, in the world of men, these stories were told again and again around campfires, in temples, and in public squares, as a way to keep alive the memory of those who dared to challenge the divine order. And so, generation after generation, the fear of the wrath of the gods was etched into the collective consciousness, reminding all that the most terrifying punishment was not the one that ended with death, but the one that began right after it. With these warnings still echoing, the stories of Olympus would continue on their course, bringing passions and conflicts to another level. The tragedies between gods and mortals that, inevitably, were about to begin. Tragic loves and cursed fates. At the heart of Greek mythology, love was never a light or simple feeling. It was an overwhelming torrent, an uncontrollable force that could elevate mortals and gods to the most glorious heights of happiness, or drag them, mercilessly, into the darkest abysses of tragedy. In these tales, love rarely offered a happy ending. What prevailed was obsessive desire, desperate decisions, betrayal, death, and at best, a painful transformation that left the protagonists marked forever. One of the most well-known and symbolic stories is that of Echo and Narcissus. Echo, a nymph condemned to repeat only the last words she heard, became a victim of Hera's fury. Tired of her distractions and deceits, Hera took away her ability to initiate any conversation. From that day on, Echo wandered through the forests, unable to express her feelings freely. And it was then that she crossed paths with Narcissus, a young man of such extraordinary beauty that no living being could pass by without stopping to gaze at him. Echo fell in love instantly, but her curse prevented her from confessing her love. She could only repeat, like an echo, the words of Narcissus. When she finally dared to reveal her feelings, the young man rejected her with devastating coldness. Narcissus, incapable of loving anyone but himself, walked away without looking back. Echo's despair was so great that little by little she withered away until she disappeared completely, leaving behind only her voice, repeating the last words of those who passed through her forest. But fate did not spare Narcissus either. As punishment for his arrogance and lack of compassion, he was condemned to fall in love with his own reflection. Unable to tear himself away from the image he saw in the water, he died beside that pond, staring at himself until his final breath. There, where his body fell, the first Narcissus flower bloomed, as a reminder that narcissistic love leads only to self-destruction. Another story that captures the true weight of tragic love is that of Apollo and Daphne. Apollo, the god of light, music, and prophecy, fell victim to a cruel joke by Eros himself. It all began when Apollo, in an act of arrogance, mocked the power of Eros, belittling his ability to influence hearts. In response, Eros fired 2 arrows, one of gold, which ignited desire, aimed at Apollo, and one of lead, which provoked absolute rejection, aimed at Daphne. The result was inevitable. Apollo fell madly in love with the nymph, while she, feeling an uncontrollable repulsion, fled from him every time he tried to approach. The chase was long and anguishing. Daphne, exhausted and with no way to escape, begged her father, the river god Peneus, to save her. And so, in an act of compassion, he transformed her into a laurel tree, just as Apollo was about to reach her. The god, defeated and full of sorrow, declared the laurel his sacred tree, promising to wear its branches as a crown for all eternity, a lasting reminder of a love that could never be fulfilled. But if there was ever a story that portrayed, like no other, the pain of loss and the desire to defy even death itself, it was that of Orpheus and Eurydice. Orpheus, the greatest musician and poet who had ever lived, possessed the gift of moving even stones and animals with his lyre. His love for Eurydice was so pure that it seemed to challenge any tragedy. But fate had other plans. On the day of their wedding, Eurydice was bitten by a snake and died before they could begin their life together. Orpheus, consumed by grief, decided to do the impossible, descend into the underworld to bring back his beloved. With his music, he achieved the unthinkable. Hades and Persephone, the rulers of the realm of the dead, were so moved that they granted him a unique permission. Eurydice could return with him to the world of the living, but under one terrible condition. Throughout the entire journey back, Orpheus must not look back. Not no matter how much he wanted to, not no matter how tempting the doubt or fear. And so the journey began. Orpheus moved forward, hearing Eurydice's steps behind him, feeling her presence but never daring to turn his head. Each step was an act of faith, each meter traveled a battle against despair. And just as the light of the upper world began to appear before his eyes, the anxiety became unbearable. Orpheus, driven by the most human impulse of all, turned around. Just for an instant, just one glance. But it was enough. Eurydice, still within the threshold of the underworld, was dragged back into the shadows. This time, forever. Orpheus, devastated, returned to the surface alone, knowing he had lost his love for the second and final time. Orpheus's grief was so profound that he renounced all human company and spent the rest of his days in solitude, singing melodies that spoke of love, loss, and despair. His death, at the hands of the Minotaurs, was as tragic as his life. But even in his end, the Muses gathered his lyre and placed it among the stars as a constellation, granting him the immortality he had never achieved in life. But not all tragic loves were born from loss. Some were the result of uncontrollable passions and inevitable punishments. Such was the case of Phaedra and her stepson Hippolytus. Phaedra, married to Theseus, fell into an obsessive love for Hippolytus, the son her husband had from a previous relationship. Rejected by the young man and consumed by shame, Phaedra decided to falsely accuse him of having tried to force her. Theseus, blinded by rage, cursed his own son and called upon Poseidon to destroy him. Hippolytus died in a terrible accident, and shortly after, overwhelmed by guilt, Phaedra took her own life. Greek mythology did not portray love as a refuge, but as a dangerous force, one capable of building but also of destroying with equal intensity. Each story served as a veiled warning about the fragility of human emotions, about how easily one can fall from passion into pain, from hope into tragedy. These tales, filled with beauty and suffering, continued to be passed down from generation to generation, like scars that refuse to heal, like constant reminders that in the Greek universe, to love was an act as sublime as it was lethal. And as the echoes of these stories spread through the world of men, new figures began to emerge, figures capable of challenging not only the gods, but also their own fate. Figures who, blending divine and human blood, would open the door to a new generation of heroes destined to change the course of history. The heroes born between gods and men. In the vast gallery of characters that populate Greek mythology, there is one figure that always stands out above all others: the hero. That creature halfway between the human and the divine, born from the often capricious and nearly always problematic union between a god and a mortal. Beings who belong to neither world entirely, too human to be accepted among the gods, but too exceptional to live as ordinary men. Greek mythology is filled with these characters, whose destiny seemed to be written even before their birth. From their first breath, their existence was surrounded by prophecies, curses, or promises of glory and tragedy. Their lives became a constant act of balance between the pursuit of honor and the fear of a violent end, as if the very universe had condemned them to always live on the edge of the abyss. Perseus is one of the first to stand out in this lineage of demigods. Son of Zeus and Danae, his story began under circumstances as improbable as they were cruel. Acrisius, king of Argos and grandfather of Perseus, had received a terrifying prophecy. He would be killed by his own grandson. To prevent this, he locked his daughter away in a bronze tower, isolating her from all human contact. But no wall is thick enough when a god like Zeus decides to intervene. Transformed into a golden rain, the god reached Danae and thus conceived Perseus. Destiny, as always, was relentless. After a series of events and betrayals, Perseus ended up facing one of the most feared creatures in mythology: Medusa, the Gorgon capable of turning anyone who looked directly at her into stone. Armed with a shield polished like a mirror, a curved sword, and a helmet that granted him invisibility, Perseus managed to defeat her, carrying her head as a trophy and using its power in future feats. A victory that sealed his place among the great names of heroic mythology. Another unforgettable hero was Bellerophon, born from the love between a mortal and the goddess Eurynome. Brave and arrogant in equal measure, Bellerophon was chosen to face the Chimera, a beast with an impossible body, made up of parts of a lion, a goat, and a serpent. Riding Pegasus, the winged horse that only he was able to tame, Bellerophon defeated the monster. However, arrogance became his greatest enemy. Blinded by pride, he attempted to ascend to Olympus riding Pegasus, thus defying the order imposed by the gods. Zeus, unwilling to tolerate such audacity, sent an insect to sting the horse. Bellerophon fell from the heights and spent the rest of his life wandering alone and disfigured, remembering each day the price of his pride. Atalanta represents another facet of the hero, less tied to direct descent from the gods, but equally marked by the extraordinary. Abandoned at birth and raised by bears in the forests of Arcadia, Atalanta grew up strong, agile, and fierce. Her skill as a huntress and her speed made her famous. She participated in the Caledonian boar hunt and was the protagonist of one of the most well-known races in mythology. Atalanta had sworn to remain a virgin, and to avoid marriage, she challenged her suitors to a race. If they beat her, they could marry her, but if they lost, they would pay with their lives. Many men fell, but finally, Hippomenes, using his wit and 3 golden apples given by Aphrodite, managed to distract her and win the race. The end of this story, however, was not happy either. Both were punished by the gods and transformed into lions, condemned to eternally pull the chariot of the goddess Cybele. The common theme in all these stories is that the Greek hero did not live to find peace, but to fight, to suffer, and ultimately to leave behind a legacy that would transcend their own existence. These demigods, despite their power, never escaped human fragility. Their divine blood granted them strength and abilities beyond the ordinary, but it did not make them immune to death or suffering. In fact, in many cases, it was precisely their hybrid nature and their closeness to the gods that doomed them to fates more tragic than those of any common mortal. To be a hero meant facing impossible trials, crossing boundaries that no one else dared approach, and almost always bearing the weight of decisions that would affect not only their own lives, but those of entire generations. Every victory brought with it a new challenge. Every moment of glory was the prelude to a painful fall. Greek culture found in these figures a mirror to reflect its own fears and aspirations. Through Perseus, Bellerophon, Atalanta, and many others, it explored the eternal struggle between the desire for greatness and the fear of divine punishment. Glory was always within reach, but it was never free. And while these heroes traveled paths filled with monsters, betrayals, and impossible choices, a new figure, far more complex, began to take shape among the pages of myth. A character whose story would mark a before and after in the heroic tradition. Heracles, the most tormented son of Zeus and one of the most celebrated heroes of all time. The 12 Labors of Heracles. If there is a name that resounds with force in the heroic tradition of Greece, it is Heracles. Son of Zeus and of the mortal Alcmena, his destiny was marked even before he was born. The wrath of Hera, who could not bear the existence of yet another illegitimate child of her husband, pursued him from his very first breath, turning his life into an endless chain of trials, sufferings, and tragedies. Heracles was not simply a warrior endowed with immense strength. He was both a victim and an instrument of the will of the gods. The story that turned him into a legend began with an act of madness induced by Hera herself. In a fit of fury, the goddess sowed such confusion in the mind of Heracles that, unable to recognize his family, he ended up killing his wife and his children with his own hands. When the fog of delirium lifted and Heracles became aware of what he had done, the weight of guilt crushed him as no other force ever could. From that moment on, his life was devoted to atonement. The oracle of Delphi, the voice of Apollo, dictated his punishment and the path toward redemption. He was to place himself at the service of King Eurystheus of Mycenae, his cousin, and complete 12 labors that would test his body, his mind, and his spirit. These were not simple tasks. They were impossible challenges, designed to break any being, even one like him. The first of these labors took him to the forest of Nemea, where a monstrous lion spread terror. Its hide was so tough that no human weapon could pierce it. Heracles, after trying in vain to kill it with arrows, decided to face it with his bare hands. He strangled the beast until it suffocated. Then, using the animal's own claws, he skinned it, and from then on wore its pelt as armor, a visible symbol of his first great victory. The second challenge was in Lerna, a swamp infested by the Hydra, a creature with multiple heads that, each time one was cut off, 2 new ones would grow in its place. Heracles realized that brute strength would not be enough. With the help of his nephew Iolaus, he devised a tactic. After cutting off each head, they would cauterize the neck to prevent new ones from growing. Thus, with strategy and determination, he defeated the Hydra, although this labor would later be questioned, since he had received help to complete it. The third task was to capture alive the Ceryneian hind, a sacred animal consecrated to Artemis, with bronze hooves and golden antlers, so swift it seemed impossible to catch. Heracles pursued it for an entire year, crossing forests and mountains, until with a light but precise wound, he managed to capture it without killing it. Next came the Erymanthian boar, an enormous beast that laid waste to everything in its path. Heracles cornered it in the snow, wore it down, and captured it alive, bringing it back to Mycenae to display his victory. The fifth labor was to clean the stables of Augeas, which had accumulated the filth of hundreds of animals over decades. No one had ever been able to do it. Heracles, using his ingenuity, diverted the course of 2 rivers so that the torrent of water swept away all the filth in a single day. However, since he had not done it directly with his hands, Eurystheus disqualified the accomplishment. The sixth challenge was to eliminate the Stymphalian birds. Creatures with iron beaks and metallic feathers, they shot like projectiles. With the help of a pair of magical symbols given to him by Athena, Heracles startled them and then brought them down with his bow. The seventh labor took him to Crete to capture the bull that was wreaking havoc on the island. Unarmed and relying solely on his strength, Heracles managed to subdue the animal and bring it back to Mycenae. The eighth task was to tame the mares of Diomedes, horses that fed on human flesh. Heracles confronted Diomedes and, in a dark twist of the tale, offered the king himself as food to his beasts to calm them. Only then was he able to lead them back. The ninth task took him to the lands of the Amazons. He was to obtain the belt of Hippolyta, queen of these warriors. At first, Hippolyta agreed willingly, but Hera, ever watchful, sowed discord among the Amazons, provoking a battle in which Heracles had to fight to secure the prized belt. The 10th labor required him to capture the cattle of Geryon, a giant with 3 bodies. The journey was long and full of obstacles, including the creation of the Pillars of Heracles at the Strait of Gibraltar, which would mark the limits of the known world. At last, after facing Geryon and his watchdog Orthrus, Heracles completed the task. The penultimate challenge was to steal the golden apples of the Garden of the Hesperides, fruit that granted immortality. Heracles searched for a long time to find its location, and when he did, he convinced Atlas to help him. While the Titan held up the sky, Heracles took the apples, later tricking Atlas into taking back the celestial burden. Finally, the 12th and last labor, to capture Cerberus, the 3-headed dog that guarded the gates of the Underworld. Unarmed, relying only on his strength, Heracles descended into the realm of Hades, faced the monster, and brought it back to the surface, thus completing the cycle of tasks that would raise him to the rank of legend. But the 12 labors did not mark the end of his suffering. Heracles continued to face betrayals, battles, and new challenges until the last day of his life. And only after his death, upon a burning pyre that consumed his mortal body, did Zeus bring him to Olympus, granting him the immortality he had so greatly earned. Thus, the greatest hero of Greece finally found a place among the gods, closing the most epic and painful chapter of his existence, while new heroes began to write their own stories in the endless fabric of mythology. The adventure of the Argonauts. In the vast universe of Greek mythology, few stories evoke such a sense of adventure, betrayal, courage, and magic as the expedition of the Argonauts. It was an enterprise that brought together the most renowned heroes of their time, all aboard the same ship, facing challenges that seemed designed to break any human will. And at the center of it all was Jason, a man destined to reclaim a throne that was rightfully his, but which fate and envy had wrested from his hands. It all began in Iolcus, a city marked by betrayal. King Aeson, Jason's father, had been overthrown by his own brother, Peleus, an ambitious and ruthless man who, fearing future revenge, ordered the assassination of all legitimate heirs who might claim the throne. Jason, just a child at the time, was saved from the massacre and sent to the mountains, where he was raised by the wise centaur Chiron, who taught him the arts of war, music, and medicine. He grew up far from home, but never forgot his origins or the weight of the injustice done to his family. When Jason reached adulthood, he decided it was time to return to Iolcus and reclaim what was his by right. His arrival in the city was anything but discreet. In a gesture that would later be interpreted as a sign from the gods, Jason crossed a river wearing only one sandal, having lost the other on the way. This image struck fear in Peleus, who remembered clearly an ancient prophecy. He should beware the man who came wearing only one sandal. Peleus, feigning cordiality but moved by fear, proposed a challenge that was in fact a deadly trap. If Jason desired the throne, he must first retrieve the Golden Fleece, a sacred relic guarded in distant Colchis at the far edge of the known world. A nearly suicidal journey, filled with dangers that seemed insurmountable. Undaunted, Jason accepted the challenge. News of his quest spread quickly, attracting the greatest heroes of Greece. Among them were legendary figures such as Heracles, Orpheus, Castor and Pollux, Meleager, Atalanta, and many more. Together they would form the most celebrated crew of antiquity, the Argonauts, named after their ship, the Argo, built by the master shipwright Argus and blessed by Athena. The expedition set sail across unknown seas, facing from the start trials that tested their endurance and wit. On the island of Lemnos, for example, they encountered a community composed exclusively of women who, after murdering all the men of their land, lived alone and in isolation. The tension was palpable from the beginning, but after long negotiations and mutual seductions, the Argonauts were able to continue their journey without conflict, though they left behind broken hearts and unkept promises. Later, they faced the giants of Berbecia, where Heracles, with his immense strength, was crucial to the group's survival. In Thrace, they visited King Phineus, a man cursed by the gods, condemned to live surrounded by food he could never eat, as harpies, repulsive winged creatures, would snatch it away just before each bite. In an act of mercy, the Argonauts freed Phineus from his torment, and in return, the king offered them invaluable information, the safest route to cross the dreaded clashing rocks. These rocks, known for crushing anything that passed between them, were a deadly obstacle. The strategy was risky. They first released a dove and watched as the rocks crashed together and then separated again. Seizing that brief opening, the ship Argo sailed through at full speed, brushing death but emerging victorious. Each leg of the journey seemed designed to break their spirit. They passed through lands of warrior Amazons, faced sea monsters, sailed through furious storms, and resisted deadly temptations. But all of that was merely the prelude to the true challenge: reaching Colchis and obtaining the Golden Fleece. King Aeetes, ruler of that land and guardian of the fleece, had no intention of giving such a treasure to foreign strangers. He imposed on Jason a series of tasks that bordered on the impossible. He had to plow a field using bulls that breathed fire, sow it with dragon's teeth, and then face the warriors who would sprout from the earth as a result of that cursed sowing. It seemed a foretold death. But this is where the story took an unexpected turn. Medea, daughter of Aeetes and priestess of Hecate, the goddess of magic, fell in love with Jason almost from the moment she saw him. Her passion was as intense as it was dangerous. She knew that helping him meant betraying her family and her homeland. But even so, she gave him a magical ointment that would protect him from the bull's flames, and taught him the secret to defeating the earth-born warriors. He had to throw a stone among them so that, confused, they would begin to fight each other. Thanks to Medea's intervention, Jason completed all the trials. However, King Aeetes, enraged by the deception, refused to honor his promise, and Jason, with Medea's help, stole the Golden Fleece. The escape was frantic. With the Argo at full sail, the Argonauts fled under the pursuit of the Colchian fleet. The legend darkens further when it tells how Medea, in a desperate act to stop her father, murdered her own brother and scattered his remains into the sea, forcing Aeetes to stop and recover them in order to give him a proper burial. That night, under a sky filled with storms and guilt, the group continued their return journey. The voyage back to Greece was no less perilous. They faced the sirens, whose hypnotic song promised certain death. Once again, the music of Orpheus, more powerful and vibrant than any spell, saved the crew from certain doom. They also had to cross the waters haunted by Scylla and Charybdis, sea monsters capable of destroying any ship. Finally, after countless dangers and losses, Jason and the Argonauts returned to Iolcus, carrying the Golden Fleece. But the glory they had earned far away did not guarantee happiness at home. What awaited Jason was not a triumphant welcome, but a new chain of betrayals, conflicts, and tragedies that would mark the rest of his life. And so, while the echoes of this Odyssey continued to spread across Greece, other stories were beginning to take shape. Tales of heroes confronting not only monsters or gods, but also their own fate, as the tragic story of Oedipus would soon reveal. The myth of Oedipus and the power of fate. At the heart of Greek mythology are stories that do not revolve around monsters, physical feats, or spectacular interventions by the gods. There are tales that explore something far deeper and more terrifying: the impossibility of escaping fate. Among all of them, the myth of Oedipus stands as one of the most powerful tragedies, a brutal reminder that no matter how far one runs, what is written by the gods or by the universe cannot be undone. It all began long before Oedipus drew his first breath. King Laius of Thebes, haunted by a prophecy that had tormented him for years, received a prediction that would freeze the blood of any father. His own son was destined to kill him and marry his wife, Queen Jocasta. Terrified, Laius made a decision intended to alter the course of events. Once the child was born, he ordered that his ankles be pierced and that he be abandoned on Mount Cithaeron, left to die exposed to the elements. But fate has a twisted way of fulfilling its designs. A shepherd, who found the wounded and crying infant in the mountains, took pity on him and carried him far from Thebes. Eventually, the child was given to Polybus and Merope, king and queen of Corinth, who, unaware of his origins, decided to adopt him and raise him as their own heir. They named him Oedipus, which means swollen feet, a painful reminder of his earliest days. Oedipus grew up with all the comforts of a prince, educated in the arts, philosophy, and strategy. But as the years went by, rumors began to circulate questioning his lineage. Tormented by doubt, he visited the Oracle of Delphi in search of answers. But what he received was a prophecy even more devastating than any rumor. He was destined to kill his father and marry his mother. Horrified by such a revelation and convinced that his adoptive parents in Corinth were his true parents, Oedipus decided to flee the city. His logic was simple but flawed. If he stayed away from them, he could avoid fulfilling the prophecy. However, every step he took on that journey brought him closer to the very fate he sought to escape. At a crossroads, Oedipus encountered an older man accompanied by his entourage. A conflict arose over something as trivial as the right of way, but the argument escalated with the kind of speed that only tragedies on the verge of eruption possess. Rage flared, weapons were drawn, and without knowing the identity of his opponent, Oedipus killed the man and his companions. That man was Laius, king of Thebes and his true father. The first part of the prophecy had just come to pass, and Oedipus remained completely unaware. Continuing his journey, Oedipus arrived in Thebes, a city gripped by terror. The Sphinx, a creature with the body of a lion, the wings of an eagle, and the face of a woman, had imposed a deadly challenge. Only those who could correctly answer her riddle were allowed to enter the city. The rest were devoured. The riddle seemed simple on the surface, but was deadly in its consequences. What is the creature that walks on 4 legs in the morning, 2 at noon, and 3 in the evening? Oedipus, using his intelligence and analytical mind, answered without hesitation. The human being, crawling on all 4s in infancy, walking upright in adulthood, and relying on a cane in old age. The answer was correct. The Sphinx, defeated for the first time, threw herself into the abyss and died. The city, liberated, welcomed Oedipus as a hero. As a reward, the people and the nobles of Thebes crowned him king, and to strengthen the legitimacy of his rule, he was given the hand of the widowed queen, Jocasta. Unknowingly, he had just fulfilled the second part of the prophecy. Oedipus, the lost son, had become the husband of his own mother and the father of his own siblings. For years, the city prospered under his rule. The people saw in him a just, intelligent, and decisive leader. No one suspected the monstrous secret hidden beneath that appearance of normality. The tragedy began to unfold when a plague struck Thebes. The fields withered, animals died without reason, and women could no longer bear children. Desperate to save his people, Oedipus decided to consult the oracle once again. The answer was direct and devastating. The curse would only end when the murderer of Laius was found and punished. And so began a relentless search for the culprit, with Oedipus having no idea that he himself was the object of his own pursuit. Each clue, each testimony, each fragment of truth dragged him closer to the abyss. He consulted the blind prophet Tiresias, who, after resisting, revealed the truth in veiled but forceful terms. Oedipus, furious, refused to believe it, unable to imagine that everything he had built was founded upon incest and parricide. The tension grew when a messenger from Corinth arrived with seemingly good news. King Polybus had died, and Oedipus could return and claim the throne. But during the conversation, the messenger revealed a truth that shattered Oedipus's final illusions. Polybus was not his real father. That was when the last link in the chain broke. The very shepherd who had once saved him on Mount Cithaeron was found and forced to speak. The truth was laid bare before everyone. Oedipus was the son of Laius and Jocasta. The killer Thebes had been seeking was its own king. The outcome was as brutal as it was inevitable. Jocasta, unable to bear the revelation, took her own life in her chambers. Oedipus, horrified by what he had done and by the fate he had tried so hard to escape, took the brooches from his mother-wife's gown and used them to gouge out his eyes. He chose to live in darkness as a self-imposed punishment for his moral blindness and for his failure to see the truth before it was too late. Banished from Thebes, he began a long pilgrimage across Greece, accompanied only by his daughter Antigone, who remained by his side when all others had abandoned him. The figure of Oedipus was etched into collective memory as the ultimate example that, in the face of fate, no cleverness, no power, and no human will is enough. The tragedy of Oedipus was recited for centuries, an eternal warning about arrogance, ignorance, and the unbearable weight of a future sealed before birth. A story that, beyond its drama, continues to challenge even those who hear it today, thousands of years later. The Labyrinth and the Minotaur. In Greek mythology, there are places that seem to exist beyond logic and time, spaces where human will dissolves, where fear takes physical form, and where those who enter rarely find the exit. The Labyrinth of Crete was precisely that, a setting of confusion, terror, and sealed fate. Its story begins long before anyone dared walk its corridors, when a chain of deceptions, unconfessable desires, and divine punishments gave rise to a creature that should never have existed. It all began with Minos, king of Crete, a powerful monarch, but reckless in his dealings with the gods. When he asked Poseidon for a sign to legitimize his right to the throne, The god of the sea sent him a white bull of supernatural beauty. Minos was supposed to sacrifice it in gratitude, but temptation proved stronger than his sense of duty. Fascinated by the animal, he decided to keep it in his stables and offer another in its place. The offense did not go unnoticed. Poseidon, in his infinite cruelty, decided that the punishment should be as humiliating as it was unforgettable. He inspired in Pasiphae, wife of Minos, an uncontrollable desire for the white bull. In her desperation, Pasiphae turned to the greatest artisan of the age, Daedalus. The inventor, obeying orders that bordered on madness, built a hollow wooden cow covered with real hide, inside which Pasiphae was able to consummate that unnatural act. From that union was born the Minotaur, a creature with a human body and the head of a bull, a symbol of shame and a living reminder of divine punishment. Minos, unable to kill the monster but aware of its danger, asked Daedalus to design a prison worthy of it. Thus was born the Labyrinth, a construction that obeyed no known architectural law, an endless network of corridors, blind turns, and circular passages where orientation was lost with the first step. The Minotaur was locked inside, but feeding a beast of its size and nature required a tribute that soon dragged an entire nation into suffering. Through circumstances that mixed politics and tragedy, Athens ended up condemned to send 14 youths at regular intervals, 7 men and 7 women, as human sacrifices. The city lived in a state of perpetual anguish. Families trembled upon hearing the names of their children among the chosen. Every ship that departed for Crete was a symbol of pain and defeat. In one of those fateful lotteries, Theseus, Prince of Athens, made a decision that would change the course of his life and that of his people. He volunteered to sail to Crete, determined to end the Minotaur and the chain of humiliation. The courage of Theseus was not a youthful impulse. It was a carefully considered resolve, a mixture of justice and a need for glory. Once in Crete, fate played an unexpected card. Ariadne, daughter of Minos, was deeply impressed by the courage of the Athenian prince. Perhaps it was love at first sight. Perhaps it was the desire to free herself from the dark legacy of her family. Whatever the reason, she decided to help him, giving him a ball of thread that would allow him to find his way back inside the labyrinth. The idea was simple but brilliant. Tie one end of the thread at the entrance and unwind it as he advanced through the corridors. When night fell and the doors of the labyrinth opened to admit the next group of victims, Theseus entered the darkness, guided only by the touch of the thread and the intensity of his purpose. The air inside was dense and damp. Every step seemed to lead to the same point, as if the labyrinth itself reconfigured to keep him trapped. The silence was broken only by the distant echo of deep growls, a sign that the Minotaur awaited him. When at last they met, the battle was as brutal as it was inevitable. Theseus, armed with a short sword but precise in his movements, fought with every fiber of his being against the blind fury of the beast. There was no room for elaborate strategy or for doubt. It was strength against strength, life against death. After a fierce combat, the Minotaur fell, collapsing in a pool of its own blood, marking the end of an era of terror for Athens. Following Ariadne's thread, Theseus found the way back, freed the other Athenian youths, and escaped from Crete before Minos could react. Ariadne accompanied him in his flight, leaving behind her home and family, drawn by the promise of a new beginning. But even in victory, personal tragedies did not cease. During the return journey on the island of Naxos, Theseus abandoned her. The reasons for this betrayal are one of the great mysteries of the myth. Some say it was due to the intervention of the gods, others that it was simple cowardice or selfishness. Whatever the truth, Ariadne was left alone on the shore, watching the empty horizon as the ship disappeared into the distance. Fate, which had seemed to have mercy on Theseus, soon showed him its other face. As he approached Athens, he forgot to fulfill a vital promise, to change the black sails of his ship for white ones, as he had agreed with his father King Aegeus, to signal that he was alive. Seeing those dark sails from afar, Aegeus, convinced that his son was dead, threw himself from a cliff into the sea, which from that day would bear his name, the Aegean Sea. Thus closed a chapter filled with horror, bravery, and loss. The labyrinth fell silent, the Minotaur defeated, and the waters of the Aegean marked by a tragedy that Athens would never forget. Meanwhile, the balance between men and gods began to fracture once more. New tensions, this time fueled by divine pride and jealousy among goddesses, began preparing the stage for a war that would involve not only the heroes of Greece, but would drag Olympus itself onto the battlefield. The judgment of Paris and the origin of the Trojan War. Every great conflict begins with an origin that seems small, almost insignificant at first. Just a spark that, once lit, ignites a fire impossible to extinguish. The Trojan War, one of the most famous epics in Greek mythology, was born from a dispute that appeared as trivial as choosing the most beautiful among three goddesses. But behind that choice lay wounded pride, carefully calculated deceit, and decisions that would drag kings, heroes, and even the gods themselves into a chain of tragedy. It all started with a wedding, an event meant to symbolize peace among the gods. Yet it became the very trigger of disaster. Peleus, a mere mortal of noble lineage, was to marry Thetis, a sea nymph, a Nereid. The ceremony was organized with all the splendor befitting an event attended by nearly the entire Olympian pantheon. However, one goddess was left off the guest list, Eris, the goddess of discord. Humiliated by the slight, Eris decided that if she couldn't be part of the celebration, she would at least ensure that no one forgot her. At the most solemn moment of the wedding, she threw a golden apple among the guests, shining like the sun itself, with a simple yet venomous inscription, "To the fairest." That seemingly innocent apple became the centerpiece of an immediate dispute. Three goddesses claimed it at once: Hera, the proud queen of Olympus and wife of Zeus; Athena, the goddess of wisdom and military strategy; and Aphrodite, the embodiment of desire, love, and beauty. Each was convinced that she alone was worthy of the title. Zeus, fully aware of the consequences of taking sides in a conflict like this, wisely chose to remain neutral. He did not wish to bear the responsibility of unleashing chaos among the most powerful goddesses. Instead, he passed the decision to a mortal, a young Trojan prince whose fate was already entwined with the destiny of his city, Paris. Paris, son of King Priam and Queen Hecuba of Troy, was not the simple shepherd he appeared to be at that moment. His origin was marked by fear of a prophecy. At his birth, oracles foretold that he would be the cause of Troy's destruction. Because of this, his parents abandoned him on Mount Ida, where he grew up far from the court, raised by shepherds, unaware that he belonged to the royal family. The pivotal moment came when Hermes, the swift messenger of the gods, led the three goddesses to Mount Ida. There, before the astonished Paris, they explained the weight of the task he had been given. He had to choose between them. Hera offered him power and dominion over all of Asia. Athena promised him infinite wisdom and glory on the battlefield. Aphrodite, on the other hand, played the most dangerous and seductive card. She offered him the love of the most beautiful woman in the world. Paris's decision, as one might expect, was guided by desire and temptation. Without much hesitation, he handed the golden apple to Aphrodite. In doing so, he didn't just choose the goddess of beauty. He sealed his own fate and that of his city. Aphrodite, true to her word, had to fulfill her promise. And so, she revealed Helen, the wife of Menelaus, king of Sparta, as the prize Paris was about to receive. Helen was not just a woman of incomparable beauty. Her face and figure were legendary throughout Greece. Stepdaughter of Tyndareus, but more importantly, daughter of Leda, and in the most widely accepted version of the myth, of Zeus himself, who had taken the form of a swan to conceive her. Many princes and kings had once vied for her hand, which led to a strategic decision. All suitors swore an oath to protect Helen's marriage, no matter who was chosen. When Paris, sent by his father Priam on a diplomatic mission to Sparta, met Helen, the attraction was immediate and perhaps inevitable. Aphrodite fulfilled her promise. According to some versions, Helen was seduced by Paris. In others, she was abducted, and in still others, she simply chose to go with him of her own free will. Whatever the truth, Paris returned to Troy with Helen by his side. The abduction of Helen was an unbearable humiliation for Menelaus, and the oath that all of Helen's former suitors had made suddenly gained its true significance. Agamemnon, brother of Menelaus and king of Mycenae, saw in this conflict an opportunity to strengthen his power and unify the Greek kingdoms under a common cause. He summoned the greatest heroes of Greece: Achilles, Odysseus, Ajax, Diomedes, among others. Each had personal and political reasons for joining the expedition. Some were moved by loyalty, others by the promise of glory, and not a few by hopes of plunder and riches. Paris's decision, made on a distant and seemingly isolated mountain, had set the machinery of war into motion. The gods, who until then had watched from afar, began to take sides openly and blatantly. Hera and Athena, offended by Paris's rejection, swore total support for the Achaeans, the Greek side. Aphrodite, loyal to her chosen one, would protect the Trojans. Zeus, once again, tried to remain neutral, though his indifference would itself become a decision with grave consequences. The story of the judgment of Paris is far more than a mythological beauty contest. It is the perfect example of how wounded pride, dangerous promises, and selfish decisions can trigger conflicts of disastrous proportions. The Trojan War, with its battles, betrayals, and tragedies that would shape the imagination of countless generations, now had all its players ready to take the stage. From that moment on, what was to come would not be a simple territorial dispute. It would be a clash where the blood of heroes and kings would soak the earth, where gods would descend onto battlefields, and where the most brutal and epic chapters of Greek mythology would begin to be written, with every raised spear and every wall trembling under the sound of war. The fall of Troy and the deception of the horse. After a never-ending decade of sieges, battles, and losses, the walls of Troy still stood tall. Neither the most powerful weapons of the Greeks, nor the strategies of their most celebrated heroes, nor the interventions of the gods had been enough to tip the scales definitively. The city, protected by its cyclopean walls and by the bravery of its defenders, seemed destined to resist forever. But it was precisely when the war appeared doomed to a slow agony that the boldest, most cunning, and most ruthless idea of the entire conflict emerged: the deception of the wooden horse. The patience of the Greeks was beginning to fracture. 10 years in front of Troy had left behind exhaustion, despair, and open wounds that no hero could forget. Achilles, the most feared of the Achaean warriors, had died after being struck by an arrow aimed by Paris and guided by Apollo, which found the only vulnerable point in his body, his heel. Hector, Troy's greatest defender and the pride of his people, had fallen long before under the sword of Achilles, and his body, dragged around the city walls, had been a heartbreaking spectacle for his family and his nation. Both sides were exhausted, but neither was willing to surrender. It was then that Odysseus, king of Ithaca, famous for his wit and his ability to devise plans where brute force failed, proposed a stratagem that would change the course of the war forever. His plan involved staging a complete withdrawal of the Greek armies and leaving behind a massive wooden horse as a farewell offering, apparently a tribute to Athena, goddess of war and wisdom, in a gesture of surrender and goodwill. The construction of the horse was a challenge of precision and deceit. The best Greek carpenters, following the instructions of Odysseus, carved a hollow structure large enough to hide within it a select group of warriors. Among them were the most feared and experienced fighters, including Odysseus himself and other leaders such as Menelaus and Neoptolemus, the son of Achilles. Once the horse was completed, the Greek army pretended to pack up their camps, burn their tents, and set sail for the open sea, hiding behind a nearby island to give the illusion of a complete retreat. The scene was carefully orchestrated so that the Trojans, watching from their walls, would believe that the war had finally come to an end. The next morning, the city awoke in a mixture of disbelief and relief. The battlefield, for years filled with tents, weapons, and corpses, now appeared empty. Only the imposing wooden horse remained, alone on the plain, like a monument to the Greek defeat. The debate within Troy was immediate and heated. Some, like the priest Laocoon, warned of the danger of accepting the gift. In a desperate act, Laocoon hurled a spear at the horse, provoking a hollow sound that, if interpreted correctly, could have saved the entire city. But fate seemed determined. Minutes later, two enormous sea serpents, sent by the gods, emerged from the water and devoured Laocoon and his sons in front of the gathered population. That terrifying and sudden scene was interpreted as a divine sign. Athena accepted the offering and punished those who doubted. The Trojans, convinced that the horse symbolized the end of their suffering, dragged the structure into the city, crossing the walls in a parade filled with euphoria and blind trust. Night fell, celebrations spread to every corner, and wine flowed like never before. The guard was relaxed, the city gates left open, and vigilance became practically non-existent. While the city slept, inside the horse, the Greek warriors held their breath. Every creak of the wood, every vibration caused by the festivities, increased the tension. Finally, when darkness was complete and the Trojans had fallen into a deep sleep, Odysseus gave the signal. Silently, one by one, the warriors emerged from their hiding place and began to move through the shadows. Meanwhile, the Greek ships, which had never gone far, returned to the shore in the middle of the night. The warriors waiting outside the walls joined the attack. From within and from without, Troy was instantly surrounded. The massacre was brutal. The streets ran red with blood. The houses burned uncontrollably. Men, women, the elderly, and children were killed without mercy. The temples, once considered sacred, were looted and desecrated. King Priam was murdered at the altar of Zeus by Neoptolemus, who, driven by a thirst for vengeance, ignored every code of honor. Queen Hecuba was captured and turned into a slave. Paris, whose judgment years earlier had unleashed this entire disaster, had died in battle days before the final fall. Helen, the original cause of the war, was recovered by Menelaus, who, according to some versions, chose to forgive her and bring her back to Sparta. According to others, their reunion was far less romantic and far more violent, filled with reproach and resentment. The fate of the Greek heroes was not kind either. Many never returned home, victims of shipwrecks, divine punishments, or later betrayals. Those who did survive, like Odysseus, began journeys that would keep them away for years, facing trials that seemed never-ending. The fall of Troy did not only mark the end of a city, it was the definitive close of an era. A symbol that even the most powerful cities can fall due to arrogance, deceit, and the thirst for vengeance. The wooden horse became forever the most perfect image of human ingenuity taken to the extreme, capable of destroying what no spear or sword had achieved in 10 years of war. After the fall of Troy, the stories of the surviving heroes would spread across the world, beginning new legends. Among all of them, few would be as long, troubled, and full of obstacles as the one Odysseus was about to begin in his desperate attempt to return to Ithaca. The Odyssey and the Journey of Odysseus. After the fall of Troy, when flames still consumed the remnants of the city and the echoes of screams floated above the waters of the Aegean Sea, another story began. perhaps less grand in terms of armies and battles, but infinitely more human and intimate. The long, harrowing, and desperate voyage of Odysseus back to Ithaca. The Odyssey was not merely a physical journey across unknown seas. It was a test of endurance, of cunning, and of will against divine and natural forces that seemed intent on breaking him. Odysseus, king of Ithaca, was famed for his wit, his ability to find solutions where the strength of other heroes failed. But even he could not foresee that returning home, a trip that under normal conditions would have lasted only a few weeks, would stretch into 10 long years of suffering and loss. It all began as the hero, along with his men, set sail from the shores of Asia Minor. The sea seemed calm, but the favor of the gods was far from with him. Poseidon, enraged by the offenses he had suffered, especially the humiliation caused by Odysseus blinding his son Polyphemus the Cyclops, became his greatest enemy, stirring the waters and throwing him off course again and again. One of the first and most famous episodes was indeed the encounter with Polyphemus. Seeking shelter and provisions, Odysseus and his men landed on an unknown island and found a cave filled with food and fresh milk. But the owner of that dwelling soon returned. Polyphemus, a giant creature with a single eye in the middle of his forehead, quickly locked up the visitors and one by one began to devour them. Odysseus, aware that no human force could defeat the beast, relied on his cunning. He introduced himself under the name Nobody, and after getting the Cyclops drunk, drove a burning stake into his eye while he slept. When Polyphemus, blind with pain, cried out for help from the other Cyclopes, he could only say that nobody was attacking him, thus creating the confusion that allowed the hero and his companions to escape. But victory came at a price. In his agony, Polyphemus called upon his father Poseidon, who from that moment turned every mile of the sea into an obstacle course for Odysseus. The journey continued to the island of Aeolus, the god of the winds, who in an act of goodwill gave Odysseus a leather sack containing all the winds of the world, except for the one that would take them directly to Ithaca. For days they sailed perfectly, finally seeing the shores of their homeland on the horizon. But the greed and curiosity of his men caused an unexpected disaster. Believing the sack held gold or treasure, they opened it mid-voyage, releasing the winds and unleashing a storm that drove them farther from their destination than ever before. The next stop was the island of the Laestrygonians, a race of man-eating giants who destroyed almost all of Odysseus's fleet, leaving him with only a single ship. The horror of that massacre barely gave them time to recover before reaching the island of Circe, the enchantress who, with a mixture of beauty and danger, turned several of his men into pigs. Once again, thanks to the intervention of Hermes and his own courage, Odysseus confronted Circe, and, after overcoming the trials imposed by the sorceress, stayed on the island for a year, forgetting, if only for a time, his obsession with returning home. But memory and duty ultimately prevailed. Before letting him go, Circe warned that he must descend to Hades, the underworld, to consult the seer Tiresias. Only then would he know the safe path home. In that descent, Odysseus faced chilling encounters. He spoke with the spirit of his mother, whom he found dead from grief over his absence, and with former comrades from the Trojan War, like Achilles and Agamemnon. Tiresias revealed that, although his return was possible, it would be plagued with suffering, and that even after reaching Ithaca, new dangers would await him. Back on the surface, Odysseus continued his voyage. On his way, he faced the hypnotic song of the sirens, creatures whose voices could drive any sailor mad. Following Circe's advice, he ordered his men to tie him to the mast of the ship while they plugged their ears with wax, becoming the first man to hear the siren's song and live to tell of it. Further on, they faced Scylla and Charybdis, two sea monsters that guarded a narrow passage. Scylla, with multiple heads, devoured sailors from any ship that passed too close, while Charybdis, a kind of living whirlpool, swallowed all that fell within her reach. They lost more men but managed to pass. When it seemed that suffering was finally easing, tragedy struck again. Upon reaching the island of Helios, where the sacred cattle of the sun god grazed, Odysseus warned his men not to touch the animals under any circumstances. But driven by hunger and exhaustion, his men disobeyed. As punishment, Zeus unleashed a storm that destroyed the ship and killed everyone, leaving Odysseus as the sole survivor. Adrift, Odysseus reached the island of Calypso, a nymph who, enamored with him, kept him captive for 7 years. During that time, she offered him immortality and an eternal life at her side. But Odysseus, loyal to his longing for home, rejected all temptations. Finally, through Athena's intervention and pressure from the other gods, Calypso let him go. After building a precarious raft, Odysseus returned to the sea, only to be attacked once more by Poseidon, who destroyed his vessel. Exhausted and on the brink of death, he was rescued on the island of the Phaeacians, where at last, after recounting all his ordeals, he received help to finally reach Ithaca. His return was bitter and tense. His palace was occupied by the suitors of his wife Penelope, a group of arrogant men who, convinced of his death, consumed his wealth and pressured the queen to choose a new husband. Penelope, astute and loyal, had resisted for years, weaving and unraveling a shroud for her father-in-law Laertes as an excuse to delay the decision. Odysseus, disguised as a beggar, studied his enemies one by one before revealing his identity. With the help of his son Telemachus, he reclaimed his home in a slaughter that ended the dishonor and restored balance to his kingdom. The journey of Odysseus was not merely a geographical crossing. It was an exploration of human limits, of perseverance in the face of adversity, and of the struggle between desire, temptation, and duty. The Odyssey, more than just a tale of adventures, became the eternal symbol of the man who, against all odds, refuses to give up until he returns home. Descents into the Underworld. Few places have inspired as much fear and fascination in Greek mythology as the Underworld. An invisible realm to the eyes of the living, it was a territory ruled by Hades, where the souls of the deceased embarked on a journey with no return. Crossing the threshold between the world of the living and that of the dead was not a privilege granted to just anyone. And yet, there were heroes who defied that boundary, who descended into the depths with a clear purpose and, on rare occasions, managed to return. The Greek underworld was not a chaotic space. It had its own order, its laws, and its guardians. The entrance was guarded by Cerberus, a gigantic three-headed dog whose mission was to prevent the dead from escaping and the living from entering without permission. Before reaching Hades' domain, the soul had to cross the river Styx, ferried by Charon, the boatman of the dead, who demanded as payment a coin, the obol, that the Greeks traditionally placed in the mouths of their deceased. Among the heroes who dared to undertake this terrifying journey, one of the first was Orpheus, the musician and poet capable of moving even stones with the sound of his lyre. The story of Orpheus and Eurydice is one of the most poignant in Greek tradition. When his wife died from a snakebite, Orpheus, unable to accept her loss, decided to defy death itself. Armed only with his music, he descended into Hades, passing through darkness and unspeakable terrors. His song was so beautiful and heart-wrenching that it softened the hearts of Persephone and even Hades himself, who agreed to let him bring Eurydice back. Under one condition. He had to walk ahead of her without looking back until they were both outside the realm of the dead. Orpheus's tragedy was his doubt. Just steps from the exit, consumed by fear that Eurydice might not be behind him, he turned around. And in that instant, he lost her forever. The image of Orpheus, alone, returning to the surface, remained a symbol of how fragile hope can be, even in the bravest of hearts. Another hero who descended into the underworld was Heracles. Among his 12 labors, the final and most feared was to capture Cerberus and bring him to the surface. Armed only with his strength, without weapons or armor, Heracles confronted the guardian of Hades. The battle was titanic, but Heracles succeeded. With Cerberus in his grasp, he returned to the world of the living, completing his task before returning the beast to its eternal post. His success was not just a testament to physical strength, but also to a will powerful enough to breach even the boundaries of death. Odysseus also had his own encounter with the underworld, though his purpose was different. He did not descend in search of a loved one, but for knowledge. Following the instructions of the sorceress Circe, he traveled to the ends of the known world to consult the spirit of the prophet Tiresias. In that descent, Odysseus not only received warnings about his uncertain future from Tiresias, he also encountered a procession of known and unknown souls. He saw his mother, Anticlea, who had taken her own life from grief over his absence. He spoke with warriors fallen at Troy, and for a moment, felt the infinite sadness of those who, even after death, continued to carry the consequences of their choices in life. Theseus and Pirithous staged another descent, one that ended far worse than the others. Blinded by arrogance and folly, they thought it a good idea to try and kidnap Persephone to make her Pirithous' wife, an offense no god of the underworld could tolerate. Upon their arrival in Hades, the god himself greeted them with a trap. He invited them to sit at a feast in his honor, but the moment they did, they were bound forever to magical chairs, unable to move. Heracles, in one of his many feats, managed to free Theseus years later, but Pirithous remained condemned to sit there for eternity. Even Psyche, protagonist of one of the most beautiful legends in mythology, descended into the underworld in her quest to regain the love of Eros. In her case, the mission was to retrieve a box containing a fragment of Persephone's beauty. Psyche's story, closer to fable and metaphor than to the epic sagas of great heroes, also demonstrates the danger of underestimating the power of the underworld, for curiosity led her to open the box, falling into a death-like sleep that only Eros himself could undo. These descents, each with its own purpose, reflect a theme that runs through all of Greek mythology. The boundary between life and death is not just physical. It is emotional, moral, and existential. Going to the underworld was not simply a matter of walking downward or crossing a dark river. It meant confronting oneself, one's deepest fears, unresolved guilt, and the memory of all those who would never return. Each journey to Hades left indelible marks. Some heroes returned with invisible scars. Others never returned at all, but all, without exception, learned that to defy death comes at a cost, and that every step into the shadows involves a negotiation with forces no mortal can ever fully control. And as the echoes of those journeys reverberated through legend, the world of mortals also began to change. The feats of the great heroes were nearing their end, and the age of myth slowly began to give way to new stories, where glory, betrayal, and destiny would take on different forms. The twilight of the heroes and the end of the mythic age. Greek mythology, filled with impossible feats and heroes immortalized in memory, also has an end to its age of splendor. A slow yet inevitable decline gradually closed the glorious chapters, those where demigods and mortals rose against monsters, endured colossal wars, or descended into the underworld in search of answers. The age of heroes was coming to an end, and that end was neither clean nor peaceful. It unfolded as a chain of tragedies, family vendettas, and conflicts that proved even the greatest could be dragged down by fate. One of the key moments in that heroic twilight was the story of the Seven against Thebes. After the harrowing events that marked the life of Oedipus, Thebes remained a disputed territory, a city trapped between the weight of fate and the echo of ancient curses. Eteocles and Polynices, the sons of Oedipus, fought a fratricidal war for control of the city, a struggle that ended in the bitterest way. Both brothers died by each other's hand, fulfilling precisely the curse hanging over their bloodline. The War of the Seven against Thebes was not just a military conflict, it was a moral tragedy. The 7 chieftains who accompanied Polynices in his attempt to reclaim the throne fell one by one before the walls of Thebes. Among them was Amphiaraus, who had foreseen his own death but nonetheless chose to join the battle, accepting that fate is, at times, stronger than free will. But as if the downfall of the fathers were not enough, the next generation arrived. The Epigoni, the sons of those fallen warriors, who years later sought to avenge their fathers' deaths. Driven by a mix of pride, grief, and a thirst for justice, they marched once again on Thebes. This time, the city could not hold. The second expedition was more effective and more brutal. Thebes fell under the siege of the Epigoni, but even that victory was soaked in blood and loss. The land that had witnessed so many tragedies was now covered by a new layer of the dead. Meanwhile, in other regions of Greece, the great heroes began to disappear one by one. Achilles, the invulnerable warrior, had fallen at the gates of Troy, struck in his only weak spot. Ajax, consumed by rage and humiliation after the arms of Achilles were awarded to Odysseus, chose suicide as his only escape from disgrace. Diomedes, after his role in the Trojan War, was never able to return to his homeland, rejected by the very gods who once protected him. Agamemnon, upon returning to Mycenae, was murdered by his wife Clytemnestra and her lover, Aegisthus, in one of the most infamous betrayals in mythology. The age of heroes seemed to crumble not just on the battlefield, but also within palaces and in the hearts of those once admired. The gods, who for generations had intervened directly in human fate, began to withdraw, allowing the will of men to follow its course with far less divine oversight. Symbolically, the twilight of the heroes represented a shift in eras, a transition from a world ruled by epic deeds and semi-divine figures to a more human, more realistic time, where the destiny of peoples no longer depended on the strength of a single individual, but on collective decisions, political intrigues, and far more worldly power struggles. The old stories began to be told differently. What had once been living legend became oral tradition, then poetry, and eventually theater and literature. The mythic cycle gradually gave way to historical times, where kings were no longer sons of gods and conflicts no longer involved supernatural creatures. Even Heracles, one of the last great heroes, whose life was a constant series of labors, punishments, and redemptions, ultimately left the mortal world after his death on the burning pyre. His body vanished, but his spirit ascended to Olympus, becoming a god. That gesture was almost a symbolic closure. The definitive hero crossed the threshold and left the earth to its fate. The end of the heroic age did not mean the end of Greek mythology, but it did mark a turning point. The focus of stories began to shift toward more earthly human conflicts, ethical dilemmas, and personal dramas. The image of the invincible warrior, the demigod capable of bending fate through sheer will, was replaced by figures more tragic, more vulnerable, closer to the everyday human experience. That era, when men challenged the gods, when monsters were vanquished through cunning or brute force, and when cities trembled at the approach of a single individual, had come to an end. What remained from that moment on was memory. The stories would continue to be told for generations, but now, more than chronicles of recent events, they would become myths, legends that would slowly begin to fade into the mist of collective memory. The mythic age was drawing to a close, but the echo of those feats, those tragedies, and those heroes who walked among gods and men would never truly disappear. For in every future tale, in every poem, in every theatrical performance, Greece would once again summon their names, reminding us that, though time marches on, there are stories that simply never die. The eternal legacy of Greek mythology. When the voices of the heroes fell silent, when battles no longer echoed across the fields of Greece, and the gods chose to retreat to their palaces on Olympus to observe the world from afar, something remained, something that time has never managed to erase: the legacy. Greek mythology was not merely a collection of ancient tales, nor a simple exercise of boundless imagination, but a deep and complex structure that shaped for centuries the way human beings understand the world. Destiny, glory, pain, and the very nature of what it means to be human. This legacy began to take root almost invisibly, embedding itself in every corner of Western culture. Philosophy, literature, art, even psychology and politics drew from those stories as if from an inexhaustible well of symbols and lessons. Homer, through his Iliad and Odyssey, did more than recount wars and impossible journeys. He crafted a way of conceiving heroism, loss, and hope that remains alive to this day. The classical playwrights, Sophocles, Euripides, and Aeschylus, found in mythology the perfect material for their tragedies. Oedipus, Antigone, Medea, or Electra ceased to be merely names passed down through oral tradition and became universal archetypes that still resonate on contemporary stages. The struggle against fate, the burden of guilt, rebellion against injustice, and the conflict between reason and emotion. These themes were captured by the myths in ways that feel almost timeless. But the legacy of Greek mythology did not stay confined to texts. Architecture and visual arts found in it an endless source of inspiration. Sculptures of gods and heroes adorned temples, plazas, and palaces. Frescoes and mosaics of later periods recreated their feats, and Renaissance painters, centuries afterward, returned again and again to depict Zeus, Athena, or Aphrodite, granting them new forms but always preserving their essence. Even in everyday language, the inheritance is unmistakable. Words like narcissism, echo, Herculean, or tantalizing come directly from the myths. Expressions like opening Pandora's box or falling into the arms of Morpheus remain part of common speech, often without speakers realizing they're invoking characters from an ancient yet ever-present world. In modern psychology, especially through the theories of Carl Gustav Jung and Sigmund Freud, Greek mythology has been a fundamental tool for exploring archetypes of the collective unconscious. The Oedipus complex, for example, is among the most well-known terms in psychology, reflecting how these ancient stories still manage to describe emotional and human conflicts that persist today. Cinema, television, and contemporary literature have also recycled, reinterpreted, and modernized these myths again and again. Epic films, young adult novels, and animated series have introduced new generations to the adventures of Perseus, the labors of Heracles, or the traps set by the gods of Olympus. Often, these modern versions adapt the stories to suit current tastes, but they keep the essential core intact: the human struggle against the impossible, the desire to transcend, and the constant fear of the consequences of our actions. Beyond entertainment, the political and philosophical thought of the West also owes a debt to Greek mythical thinking. The notion of hybris, that excessive pride punished mercilessly by the gods, has served for centuries as a metaphor for the limits of power, for corruption, and for the consequences of human arrogance. Even today's modern concept of a hero, so prevalent in contemporary film narratives, has its direct roots in Greek figures. The difference is that now heroes do not fight only physical monsters, but also their own inner demons, reenacting time and again the ancient patterns established by characters like Achilles, Odysseus, or Theseus. In academia, Greek mythology remains a subject of study, analysis, and reinterpretation. Each generation of historians, anthropologists, psychologists, and literary scholars finds in these tales a new layer of meaning. The flexibility of these myths, their ability to adapt to changing social contexts, is perhaps one of the main reasons they have never truly disappeared. But the legacy goes beyond what is tangible or academic. Greek mythology represents humanity's eternal quest to understand its place in the universe. Through those stories of capricious gods, of heroes who suffer, and of mortals who defy destiny, the ancient Greeks gave voice to the same doubts, fears, and hopes that we still feel today. When someone gazes upon a statue of Athena, recites a verse from the Iliad, analyzes an ethical conflict inspired by Sophocles, or simply reflects on the idea of fate, they are reliving, if only for a moment, the memory of a world that, far from vanishing, continues to breathe at the heart of our culture. That is the true legacy of Greek mythology, an echo that crosses the centuries. A heritage embedded in the way we tell stories, in how we explore our emotions, and in the way we try to make sense of what it means to be human. Because as long as there is someone willing to remember, retell, and reinterpret these legends, the gods and heroes of Greece will never truly die. And so we reach the end of this journey through the history of Greek mythology. A voyage through gods, heroes, tragedies, and passions that, thousands of years later, still speak to us. If you enjoyed this adventure and want us to continue exploring more stories of the past together, I invite you to subscribe, leave a comment, and share this video with those who also delight in these mysteries. Thank you for joining me once again, and, as always, good night.